Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to FAU's Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute's Behind the Science, a Wednesday web chat. Most of you probably know if you've been here before, but if not, I'm Madeline. I'm from the Outreach and Engagement Department here at Harbor Branch, and I'm going to be your host. Today's chat is going to feature someone pretty special, Dr. Jim Sullivan. He joined FAU Harbor Branch in 2015 and was named our executive director in 2018. He spent most of his career studying phytoplankton or microscopic algae and developing optical instrumentation and techniques to better understand their physiology and their ecology in our oceans. He is particularly interested in improving our scientific understanding of harmful algal blooms and also improving the communication about those harmful algal blooms to the public, to water management agencies, and especially to policymakers. And along with that, he's actually been appointed to a couple of different positions. He's one of 5 members of Florida's Blue-Green Algae Task Force. And in August 2019, he was named to Florida's Red Tide Technology Advisory Council. So he has been doing a lot of great work, and we'll get to hear a little bit about it. I'm going to chat with him for a little while, and then of course we want to hear from you guys. If you have any questions for him throughout the chat, if you're on Zoom, go ahead and use the Q&A button in the bottom center of your screen. If you're on Facebook, comment your questions as well. And then even if you just want to say hi, we'd love to hear from you. Let us know where you're watching from. So with that, we'll get Jim on here and get his mic on. Thanks so much for joining us, Jim.
Oh, I'm very happy to be here.
Well, like I said, extra special one today.
I don't know if I'm that special, but go ahead.
I don't know. You're probably one of my favorite people at Harbor Branch, that's for sure.
All right, now you're going to embarrass me.
So I guess going with a little bit of background, what's some things that weren't in your bio?
Well, I'm married. My wife is Sally. We have a 13-year-old son named Kaz, so that's an important part of my life. If you spend more than 30 minutes with me, you're going to find out that I love craft beer. It's a big part of my life. And it's not just that I like drinking beer. I mean, people like having a cocktail or whatever. I was a very serious home brewer at one time, and you can see pictures up there. That's my nano brewery that I had set up in the basement of my house. I won awards for brewing. I became a certified beer judge. And I actually thought about leaving science to start a brew pub. This is way back before the craft beer revolution actually happened. I developed a business plan. I started, taking classes on venture capitalism and trying to raise money. And one of the first things I found out, back then, it was kind of illegal to have brew pubs in most states. You couldn't make alcohol and sell it on premises. So I actually contacted my local state legislature in Rhode Island, where I was at the time, and said, how do I change this law? If I'm going to go into business, it's got to be legal. He told me, hey, go find another state where it's legal. Give me an example of their legislation and we'll write something. So at that point, I think California, Washington, Oregon, and Colorado, it was legal. It was not many states. It was on the West Coast. I got their legislation. I gave it to them. At the same time I was doing it, there was another person in the state who was also wanted to do the same thing I did. And our two legislators got together, wrote up the stuff for Rhode Island, and we changed the state law. So that was my small little piece of what I did for the state of Rhode Island. I helped make brew pubs legal in the state. Obviously, since you're seeing me here now, I did not start a brew pub. Another thing, if you hang out with me at all, you'll find out I love music and I love playing music. I have been in a number of bands. You can see these hideous pictures of me. I had a serious aversion to getting a haircut back then, so it's quite different from what it is now. One of the reasons I bring this up is if you've watched any of these through this series, you've actually seen this, a pretty common thing in scientists. You've seen scientists that we've had on this who play music. There's been a number. And this is really, really common. There's something about that music or art thing that creative mind of a scientist seems to have. And I think it's why, we have what's called STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math. Now you see people saying, no, it's STEAM. It's science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. Because there is this connection. There really is this creativity and creative thinking that draws art and science together. And that's why for you parents out there who maybe have kids who are artists, maybe they're scientists, waiting to come out. So it's to be encouraged as much as you can. And I'd say the last thing is I love to cook. So if you look at all three of those things, they all kind of involve science and creativity, but they're all things that make people happy. I like to play music for people and make beer for people and cook for people. I probably should have started a brew pub.
I mean, there's still time. Who knows where your life will go, but you still would be a scientist if you were brewing beer. It's chemistry.
Oh, it is. There's degree programs for it. It's microbiology, it's chemistry, it's a lot of those. So it is very scientific, actually.
And the craft brew industry thanks you for getting the legislation changed in Rhode Island way before they even knew they wanted it. Did the other person who wanted to start a similar business actually do it?
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. And I used to enjoy his beer. He since has gone out of business, but yeah, he did.
That's so cool. Oh, I love learning new things about all of our people. What fun new things. Okay, so actually, we're going to jump into a public question right now. Chris is asking what your favorite brewery in Florida is and the top 3 styles you made or consumed.
The beer I love the most is a really hoppy New England style IPA. So any brewery that does a good version of that, I love. Back in my home state, there's a company called Gray Sail. It makes a beer called Captain's Daughter that's awesome. There's Hetty Topper out of Vermont. Down here, Sailfish makes, right down in Fort Pierce, makes great IPAs. They make a lot of different things, but I enjoy them quite a bit. And they're close to campus.
Sorry, what was that?
I said they're close to campus, Harbor Branch.
Yes, very close by. You can come and visit us and then go visit them. I myself am more of a cider fan than a beer fan, so I like Pierce, which is also close by. So you grew up in Rhode Island, right?
I did.
So what was your journey from Rhode Island to Harbor Branch?
Yeah, and this is something I could talk about for hours. I will not do that. As most people can, life is an odd thing. And this is another thing is if you've watched this series, it's a really common thread with most scientists. And I think this is true of any career. It's really important, even for if there's young people out there watching this or graduate students or students, life is not a straight path. There's a lot of decision points in life, big and little, which are totally going to change your career. Rarely do you enter school and say, this is what I'm going to be, and that's what you end up being. That is not the way it usually works. I mean, for instance, when I was a scientist and in school, did I want to grow up and be an administrator of a site in a university? No, I never thought that. And there are very few kids who go to their parents and say, I want to be middle management. It doesn't happen that way. So to give, just to give an example of that, how I actually got here, about 5 years ago, I was working for a company. So I wasn't in academia, called Seabird Scientific, doing research and development. And during the 8 years that I was working there, the company was acquired by a much larger company. It was on SEC traded. It was part of industry consolidation that was going on back then. And really, when they bought our company, it became profits over innovation. And I was in the R&D group, one of the satellite offices. And we knew as part of this that eventually they started closing down all the satellite offices. This is how you maximize profits. You close down, other sites, consolidation. We knew it was time to, pretty much leave. At that point, I had three options in my career. I still had a position at URI, University of Rhode Island. I had an office there and a lab there. So I could have gone back there and went back to academia and just started writing grants. Easy, I knew the place, no problem, no risk. The company itself offered me a well-paying job to move my family to the West Coast and become the director of science for the company or something like that, which was also, you know, again, it was nice. It would have been hard money, which means I didn't have to write grants anymore. I'd be fully funded. But I would have been committing fully to being into business, and that would have been it. And the third option was the guy who ran the office in Rhode Island where I was working for Seabird, Mike Twardowski, said, hey, there's this institute down in Florida called Harbor Branch. It's hiring a bunch of faculty right now. So Harbor Branch was going through a big hiring phase. One of the positions was for an optical engineer, which it was perfect for him. And one was for a biological oceanographer, which was pretty much what I did. So of those three, you know, which did I choose? Why did I choose Harbor Branch? It was the highest risk of those three jobs. The other two were easy. You know, I could have done them. But the reason I chose Harbor Branch was it presented the best opportunity. I mean, it truly did. The support here, and I hadn't even been to the place, but just looking at what was available made me say, it's a lot of risk, but there's going to be a lot of reward if it works out. So I took a chance and I came to Florida. When I got here, just to make this story a little bit longer, I worked really hard. So uprooted my family, brought them down here, and I worked my butt off when I got to Harbor Branch to prove myself. I think I wrote like a dozen grant proposals, which is a lot in a year. I had an amazing thing happen where I got like 7 grants in a row funded. Some were small, but just an amazing thing to get. So after about a year, I was doing really well. And I was asked if I was nominated to be the vice chair of the faculty assembly at Harbor Branch, would I do it? And I thought about it a lot. This would take time away from my science because it's an administrative job and it was extra work. But it was another opportunity to learn something new and be the voice of the faculty to the administration, which was something I hadn't done. So I became the vice chair after an election, and then after a year, I became the chair of the faculty assembly, which means I was the representative to the administration of FAU. Harbor Branch underwent a leadership change at that point, and I was asked if I would accept becoming the interim executive director of Harbor Branch. Now, this would be, at that point, I knew that job would be for about 2 years. It would take them that long to get a new director hired. And it's a full-time job. I knew it was going to totally take me out of science during what was probably my most successful period of my career. This was a really, really big risk. I could seriously be hurting my science career. It's equivalent of when an athlete retires and a couple years later, they try to come back. You take yourself out of the game, essentially. So again, a really high risk decision, but again, high opportunity. You know, I could work to change and improve Harbor Branch. This is where I worked. So maybe I could make a lasting effect to, you know, where my home base is. But I guess in the end, I did too good a job because they offered me the permanent position after about 4 months. So that's how I got to where I am now. Now, why did I bore you with, you know, this story?
But
there are a lot of sayings, like fortune favors a prepared mind, luck is where preparation meets opportunity. And the point is, for people listening that are students and graduate students, or maybe anyone in their life, a lot of times we make our own success. And your life does not go on some grand plan. You know, many times, you know, you're not going to know what you want to do with your life. And is it bad that you don't know what you want to do with your life? No. As a matter of fact, I think if people are in college, it's good that they don't have a serious plan. Life will come at you. You know, but the thing you have to do, and this is the moral of the story, pay attention to your opportunities, make really informed decisions, and don't be afraid to take a chance. And when you commit to your choice, work as hard as you can to succeed at it. So that's my little soapbox speech.
I can second that. It definitely works. The short version for me is that I just decided to move to Florida for Harbor Branch and started volunteering. And actually, one of the very first things you did when you were interim executive director was give me a full-time job. So it worked out.
So my decision affected your decisions.
Yep. Yes, it did. But it seems to have worked out pretty well for everybody so far.
I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, I am too. You get to wear a lot of different hats here. I know that you're not doing as much science anymore, but you still do have your hand. You help out your former lab a lot, I'm sure. So some of the different things besides executive director, I guess your titles would be research professor. What's that like?
So I actually asked you to ask me this question because I think it's really important. I was a research professor, research scientist for 30 years. So I've been doing that a lot longer than I've been executive director of Harbor Branch. And I want people to know what the faculty who work at Harbor Branch go through. When you're a research professor, and I had this, you can see it on the screen there, it's a position that carries really only research duties. There's no obligation for you to teach students. You can if you want to, but you're not obligated to do it. You're a researcher. The important point is, unlike tenured faculty at universities who are paid for 9 months out of the year to teach, research professors get very little or no salary from the institution they're working at. At URI, I got no money for being a research scientist and a research professor. 100% of my salary I had to earn by going out and getting grants. This is true at Harbor Branch too. Now we do pay some salary, 30% right now of our professors' salaries are taken care of by the Institute, but they still have to come up with up to 70% of their salary through competitive grants, getting grants. And you know, this is very difficult. If you don't get a grant, you don't have a job. I mean, it's that simple. They're not tenured. And grant funding is incredibly competitive. Right now, the success rates of getting a federal grant are somewhere between 5 and 20%, probably normally around 10%. You know, and do the math. The typical grant takes 2 to 3 weeks to organize, write, and submit. If you have to write 10 of them to get one, think of, you're writing grants for half a year, and at the same time, you're supposed to be doing other research, maybe teaching students, mentoring students in your lab, writing papers, giving talks. It's an incredibly hard job, really hard, and I'm so proud of the people, the professors that work at Harbor Branch for the incredible job they do. We're one of the best units at FAU. Our people work really hard. But this is why, when people ask, why should I support Harbor Branch? You know, don't you pay all your professors? Aren't they fine? It's like, no. And this is why these scientists, if they don't get grants, they don't have a job. So if you're wondering why it's important to support Harbor Branch is to keep these scientists doing the work they can do, the really important research that they do.
You guys have gotten a little bit of a taste throughout this series of some of the different types of research that's going on. And like Jim said, grants are hard to get. So we've got an impressive faculty that's been able to get those grants, but they have to keep working every day to get new ones and then deliver on them as well. That's the big thing. So, but the delivery is probably the more fun part because you actually get to do the science that you're wanting to do. It's not sitting in your office writing up your grant proposal, writing up your paper.
I tell you though, the happiest day, usually the happiest days in most research professors' lives are when a program manager contacts them and says, we've decided to fund you. For that day, you are on cloud 9. And then you go down to your local brewery.
Yes, you go down to your local brewery and then you start working.
Celebrate, you don't have long, start working.
Yeah. So then when you're actually doing the work, you would be an oceanographer would be the title for the work that you do. What is it like actually doing the work?
Yeah, so I mean, we're an oceanographic institute. We have a number of oceanographers who work there. Not everyone's an oceanographer. That was my title. I'm trained in it, and so are a number of faculty there. And a lot of people don't necessarily realize what the job entails and what it's really like. It is a very tough, demanding job. I think Laurent last week in this series said, if you want to understand the ocean, you have to go out and get in it. Well, that's true of oceanography. You have to go out on boats, sometimes for weeks at a time, in very difficult, sometimes very dangerous conditions, and do your work. And these photos that you see there are various shots of me doing various things on boats. And one of the things you notice on a lot of these, I'm actually like working on an instrument, dealing with something. And this is the issue. If you're on a boat for 2 to 3 weeks offshore, you can't go to the local hardware store or electronics shop or call up Amazon and get a delivery when something breaks. You have to be able to fix it there, or your research doesn't happen. So an oceanographer, not only do they have to be trained in biology, physics, chemistry, and geology to understand the ocean, but they kind of have to be electricians and they have to be engineers as well. So it's an amazingly tough discipline for people, and you have to be kind of a master of a lot of different things to be a successful oceanographer. You have to understand technology, and you have to be able to fix technology. The one thing that I would say about oceanography, if someone out there is interested in going into it, it is a job unlike almost any other. You get to travel potentially all over the world and see the world's ocean. You see amazing wildlife and nature. And this is the big thing, is you understand the Earth, how our planet works, like very few people can. I mean, it really, to understand how our planet functions, and the oceans are most of our planet, it's 70% of the surface of our planet, is an amazing thing, just to have that knowledge.
These machines look pretty cool too. I couldn't imagine.
Here's where the danger comes. You can imagine, I mean, we only take pictures when it's a nice out. So these are all sunny, relatively nice pictures. You don't see the pictures when there's 20-foot waves breaking over the boat and you've got a 300-pound or a 1-ton device swinging on a wire back and forth and you're trying to grab it. I mean, it's at times, it can be pretty dangerous.
I can only imagine, and would not necessarily want to experience that myself. I can say I am not cut out to be an oceanographer. I don't have the electrical engineering knowledge either, so I think I'll stick to what I'm doing. But in all of those adventures, so you've gotten to travel the world, and I'm sure see a lot of really cool places. What are some of the coolest animals or organisms that you've encountered?
So I've seen a lot of cool things. Dolphins, whales, sharks, giant Humboldt squid at night, octopus. I've been on coral reefs. I've seen amazing jellyfish swarms in the ocean. But even though there's all those things, and that's what most people see in the ocean, what I'm interested in is algae. So I'm a total nerd. I like plankton. And the reason for this, and I'll try to convince you why it's important, they are the base of the ocean's food chain. So none of those other animals I just talked about and none of that other life would exist without them. So they're really, really important. They make most of the oxygen that we're breathing right now. Phytoplankton in the ocean produce somewhere between 50 and 75% of the oxygen on Earth. But what got me really into wanting to study them and why I think they're the coolest thing out there is all the amazing adaptations they have. These are single cell organisms, and yet they can do things that are just unbelievable. So this is one example. There's some slides up here. This is called bioluminescence. And this is for people that go down to the water at times and you see the water glow and it gives off this blue color like you see in a couple of the photos on top. That is usually caused by a particular kind of phytoplankton or algae called dinoflagellates. So it's not important what the names are, but it's an algae that can give off this light. And they do it when they're startled by mechanical stimulation. So if you poke them or a wave stirs them up, they flash this light. And there's a picture that I put on there of a cell. This is a phytoplankton cell in a light microscope on top, and below is the light coming out of it. So we could actually image it under a microscope. It's making that really beautiful blue light. The reason we studied this back in the day when I got into it, and this was my initial why I got interested in phytoplankton, is that the Navy was really interested in this. And you can kind of imagine why. If these things give off light when they're disturbed, and you look at that cartoon on the bottom right, a big submarine going through a patch of these things is going to light up. It's going to be very highly visible potentially. Back in the Cold War with the Russians, submarines were getting quieter and quieter so that we couldn't detect them with acoustics. So the Navy was really interested, can we detect them by the light they're giving off when they go through these bioluminescent phytoplankton? So this is what I did for my master's. I was heavily involved in naval research. This is anti-submarine warfare, and studied this for a number of years and got my master's on why these things produce light, how it's controlled, how much they give out. And it kind of led me into, wow, these phytoplankton are amazing things. But then it came into the second part of my career where, unfortunately, one of the other adaptations they have is they make toxin. So they can cause harmful algal blooms as well. So when you see a lot of harmful algal blooms in the world, they're created by these dinoflagellates. And now you can see there's a movie of one of these dinoflagellates. It can swim, another adaptation. It can actively swim around. And a lot of times they come up to the surface and they discolor the water, and you see those photos. Those are all harmful algal blooms. Not all of them are from dinoflagellates, but it's all algae. And I really became interested in what controls these harmful algal blooms. Back when I started studying phytoplankton and algae and harmful algal blooms, this was the early to mid 90s. Harmful algal blooms were not common. They happened for sure, but they really, they were more rare events when we had really big ones. And I've seen the world totally change in just 30, even 20 years, where harmful algal blooms now in Florida, if you live here, you know this, they're everywhere. I mean, these things are a persistent problem now. They're every summer, they're everywhere around the world, they're everywhere around our coasts, and it's just exploded. And I'm really interested in why. I mean, what's driving them? Is it us? Is it something else in nature? Is it global warming, climate change? But I've seen the world change in just a couple of decades where something went from not being that common to very common. So it's been great to study these over the years. And that's why I love them.
They are pretty cool organisms. And like you said, basis of the food chain. And I think I remember hearing a stat that they also are a huge carbon sink. They take up 50% of the carbon dioxide in the world or something. Am I wrong there?
No, I mean, if they produce 50 to 75% of the oxygen, they also have to bring in all that carbon. But the thing is, they're constantly cycling it. So they're not as much of a carbon sink because that's carbon lost versus carbon that recycles. So it's a little bit different. But they are a carbon sink. Some of it is lost to the bottom of the ocean, for sure.
So I have a couple more questions, but a reminder for our audience, if you guys have questions about Jim's amazing career or his research with phytoplankton or anything, feel free to ask those. Use the Q&A button on Zoom or just comment your questions on Facebook. So of all of your projects with phytoplankton and new technologies that you've developed, what has been your favorite project so far?
I can't pick one, but as you've mentioned, I've actually been responsible for developing or co-developing a lot of different equipment. And this is another thing about oceanography where you kind of have to be somewhat of an engineer. If you want to study something and someone didn't make a piece of equipment that could do what you wanted, well, you had to develop it. I mean, you had to go find an engineer and build it. So all the different engineering projects that I've been involved with over the years, more recently, I was involved with developing an in situ holographic microscope, and actually the slide just came up. That's a live video feed from this microscope. And this is kind of a teaser for next week, but the person I worked on this with, Professor Nyack, is next week's speaker. So he can tell you a lot more about this, but I've been involved in a lot of different technology development, but it was all done so I could understand algae and phytoplankton in a better way. Because we need these tools, and if they didn't exist, we had to invent them and essentially make them. So that, you know, just being involved in technology development and making instruments that the rest of the community, science community could use is very rewarding. That's my favorite part of science, really.
Harbor Branch has developed a good number of technologies over the years that other groups are probably a little envious of.
Yeah, we're still doing it to this day. I mean, there are a lot of great projects going on right now, and that's one of the strengths of Harbor Branch, is developing new technology. So, which is one of the reasons, again, why I wanted to come here in the first place.
Very good, yeah. So we'll start to get into some of those public questions now. Again, I say it a lot, but the reminder for you guys for how to ask questions, use the Q&A button on Zoom or comment them. We would definitely love to hear from you. So our first question here is what research has led to policy changes to reduce harmful algal blooms? And that's from Jeannie.
What research has led to policy changes?
Yeah.
Quite a bit. I mean, probably the biggest one I could point to is we know now one of the reasons we've seen a big increase in harmful algal blooms all over the world is the nutrient pollution we're putting into our coastal waters and into our lakes. So essentially, these are plants and we're fertilizing the water. So just like you fertilize a crop, we're fertilizing these things to grow. So the big thing that's come out of it is nutrient regulation. So that is the number one, and it's the only thing we can really control. So I would say number one is we have to stop putting so many nutrients into our water, and different states are in various degrees of trying to control that. Florida's in the middle of trying to do it right now.
Yeah, and knowledge is definitely power. Can't change stuff if you don't know what's going on. So that's a really valuable one. And I think a lot of people in Florida are even coming around to it, even without some huge policy changes. It's becoming more common knowledge.
Yeah, no, and that, I mean, that, even though it's very basic science, it is science, and you have to tell people, hey, if you're putting fertilizer on your lawn, or if you have a bad septic system, or whatever it is, you are potentially partly responsible for this. So you have to try to make it, even little changes make a big difference.
All right, our next question from the community is, will we see toxic blue algae this summer? Probably meaning the blue-green algae. Okay,
so you can't take this as a, you know, I can predict, but I can't guarantee this is going to happen, or, yes. However, right now what we're seeing, which is a lot of rain, kind of, if I was to guess, this may be a bad year for blue-green algal blooms. We had similar kind of rain events and long periods, you know, a couple of weeks of rain here and there in 2016 and 2018. So if I was to guess, and I hope I'm wrong, this could be another somewhat severe year for algal blooms, because all this rain eventually washes nutrients from the land into the water, and it helps fertilize these blooms even more. So there's usually a kind of a direct correlation between the amount of runoff we get in the springtime and whether the blooms are bad in the summer. So unfortunately, it might be a bad year.
Would that probably be the same sort of story on the West Coast with red tide?
It could be, but that dynamic is different. Certainly if the red tide gets into the coast and we have a lot of discharges of nutrient-rich water, yes, it'll enhance the bloom for sure. But understanding how that bloom starts every year, it's not necessarily triggered to the coastal pollution. It certainly feeds it once it gets going, but it's a little bit different than like the blooms that we get in Lake Okeechobee. They're different dynamics, different phytoplankton, so they grow differently.
Okay, so not necessarily the same influences, but probably the same sort of prediction then, or not much? I guess it depends more on the weather patterns, if red tide comes in.
It does, whether we have tropical storms, how it stares up the Gulf, that one's a little bit more complex.
Okay, all right. Next question is, what has been the most rewarding part of your job? I guess you could pick whichever stage of your career you want there, or from each stage of your career.
Yeah. I mean, working with students, mentoring students is always great. You know, everyone says that. I mean, we want to, once we have knowledge, we want to share it with people, and that's an obvious one. I would say now, in my current job, facilitating science for our scientists, helping them be better scientists or help support their work, that is the most rewarding thing I can do, is to make Harbor Branch, you know, the best place it can be. So I find that now very rewarding. I'm not doing the science myself, but I'm facilitating other people, you know, to do much better science if they can, or support them to do the science, you know, bring them money, bring them support. So that's my challenge. And, you know, I find it rewarding when I have little successes.
That's good. You gotta appreciate the little things, find something new to learn every day and something new to appreciate every day. So next question is from Sarah. What do you think is the most important thing for people to know about Harbor Branch?
That we're a world-class oceanographic institute with some of the best scientists in Florida, and that we need all the support we can get from you. You know, I kind of explained it.
Yeah.
Our scientists are great, but they need support, and it's not a joke. I mean, as we get budget cuts from the state, as the federal government cuts science, we have to lean more and more on the public to maintain our science and support us. I mean, it's becoming, for all science institutes around the country and the world, we're looking to philanthropy and the input from the public to help us continue our mission of science. So it's a big deal.
Yeah. All right, next question here is from Stuart. He's saying, I love the pictures of you playing music. I love music too. And asking if you're still playing a lot of music, if that's something that you spend a lot of your free time on.
I don't have a ton of time to play music. I still occasionally do. If you go to the Kilted Mermaid, which is a bar in Vero Beach, on a Wednesday during open mic, you may see me there. That's all I'll say.
Okay.
Actually, one of those pictures that was up there was from the Kilted Mermaid about 2 years ago.
Oh my gosh. I'll have to try and check that out sometime then. Do you and Tim still play together?
We do. And a matter of fact, that picture right in the middle, which that's the Kilted Mermaid, if you know the bar, the person next to me is Tim Moore.
I thought that was him when I saw the picture earlier. I was like, this is.
And actually, the person next to me on the picture on the right-hand side, right next to that, is Dr. Mike Twardowski, another Harbor Branch faculty member, when he was a little bit younger, as I was.
And then that picture all the way over on the other side with you in the green suit, is that from that same event that Tim Moore talked about?
It was. It was a St. Patrick's Day parade. We were playing Irish music in the back of a truck, and that's Tim in the background there. If you know Tim, if you can see him. Yeah. All scientists, though. Remember, all these people are scientists. So.
And it's a pretty small world, for sure. But all right, Kilted Mermaid Wednesday night open mics. I'm gonna have to check that out at some point and see if I catch you. So I think we've got time for about 1 or 2 more questions. Feel free to send them in. Let's see. What are the main things researchers at Harbor Branch are focused on? Like the big overarching themes, I guess, or different departments?
It's a good question. We do a lot of different things. It's hard. It would take me 45 minutes just to try to briefly go over it all. But in a grand sense, we do a lot of marine conservation work with fisheries, coral reefs, marine mammals, things like that, studying their ecology, protecting them, all that kind of stuff. We do, as we talked about, a lot of ocean engineering, so technology development. We do a lot of defense work too. So we actually are involved with the Navy and different defense contractors. We're involved with harmful algal bloom research, obviously. We do ocean health and human health type studies. That's a big part of what we do. And lastly, we have one of the larger aquaculture programs in the state. So a lot of research on developing better techniques for United States aquaculture, trying to improve that, which is an important thing we need to do as a country. And those are the 4 major areas we work in.
Awesome. Seems like a pretty good note to wrap up our chat on, those big overarching Harbor Branch themes, which if you want to learn more about those themes or some of those projects, you can definitely go back. You can watch some of the other Behind the Science episodes that we've had. You can visit our website and you can read about our research. And then you can check out our different virtual programming and also stay up to date with when we're going to be able to welcome the public back to our campus and continue offering some of our other well-known programs like the Ocean Science Lecture Series, but you can still watch those online as well. So thank you guys so much for joining us. Thanks, Jim. I think you probably already turned off your camera there, but thank you for joining. Thanks to the audience for the wonderful questions. Next week's Behind the Science is going to feature Dr. Audie Nyack. His work focuses on how fluids and gases move in our oceans and aquatic environments. And as Jim said earlier, he's working a lot with that holographic imaging system that hopefully will be able to be used for some long-term marine studies. And hopefully we'll hear a little bit about that next week. He also, again, is working with phytoplankton, just like Jim. He's working to try and characterize some of their responses and their growth rates in different environmental conditions. So hopefully we'll get into some of those fun, cool phytoplankton facts with him next week as well. So hopefully you'll zoom in and join us. Next Wednesday is June 10th, and it will be, of course, at 4 p.m. And if you think of any questions, you can send them ahead of time or just ask them during the event. But thanks so much for joining us. I hope you guys have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you next week. Bye.